Okay, welcome back to another episode of Litigious. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna is here with me today as usual. Reminder, if you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe, share. Uh, it's we've had a bit of a hiatus that will likely not continue, but we're back today talking about some new stories. And there's been a lot of stuff in the news, but a few that we wanted to talk about today. So let's start with why don't we start with this one because it was more recent. There was a criminal trial in New York City that just resulted in a conviction of three prominent real estate or two brothers who were prominent in the New York City real estate market, and a third brother who were convicted in Manhattan of engaging in a years-long conspiracy to traffic women and girls for sex. 11 women had accused these three brothers, Hal, Oren, and Alan Alexander, of using drugs to incapacitate and sexually assault their victims, and some pretty nasty stuff that came out of the trial. These guys were like big time high flyers in the world of real estate and Instagram, social media in particular. And so there's a bunch of interesting kind of takes on this, but they were ultimately convicted, and each of them faced up to life in prison. One of the things I thought was interesting is that these accusations first came out publicly as a result of civil lawsuits that were filed, and that were reported by a real estate trade publication, which prompted a bunch of additional cases. And it said that by the time the federal charges were filed in December of 2024, prosecutors had already interviewed some 60 women while preparing the case, and in part assisted by the civil cases. So why don't we start there, and then we can talk a little bit about a couple other things. What do you think?
Yeah, so I guess after these civil lawsuits were reported, like you said, it kind of set off a cascade of other women sort of coming forward and realizing that these brothers had done this to what appears to be many different women, including girls who are under 18. One of the victims in the trial was a 17-year-old girl at the time of these events. And it's very nasty. I don't know. I don't know if we ever give trigger warnings on our podcast, but I mean, we are going to be talking about this. So if this is not a subject that you are comfortable listening to, then maybe not
Skip ahead.
the best one to listen to. But yeah, I mean, they were guilty on all counts. The prosecution had to drop a couple of counts because one of the victims ended up refusing to testify because I think the defense attorneys have taken a pretty scorched earth tactic against in terms of defending their clients. They have hired private investigators to go into these women's neighborhoods and ask questions about their children. They have done all of the sort of very classic victim blaming that happens in these types of cases. They blamed the women themselves for being intoxicated, not having been drugged. They called them gold diggers. They basically, I think, were forced to admit that these men are womenizers, but claimed that, their conduct was consenting.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really, unfortunately, surprising in these kinds of cases. You saw it in the Sean Combs cases. You see in a lot of these cases where it's sort of like blame the person making the complaint. And look, there's a balance because we see it in civil cases. There's you have the right to defend yourself, and you have the right to check the credibility of the witnesses who are bringing claims. And if there are things that would suggest that they're not credible in their background or um, in the sort of specific claims that they're making, then that's all fair game. But it's also a very common tactic to just sort of, just sort of try to avoid any wrongdoing, and place all the blame on the people who are making the complaints. And as in many cases, it's like one complaint, one person. You know, it's probably a little bit easier to convince a jury that maybe they are to blame versus a cascade of people coming forward with very similar claims, because at that point it starts to become like obviously a very clear pattern.
Yeah, and I think in terms of something that we are civil attorneys, and this idea that just because you have a civil lawsuit, you're really just out for money and not really for justice. I think we have sort of a philosophical as well as practical objection to that sort of mentality, because this case is actually kind of an outlier that these super rich and powerful men have actually been held accountable. So we've talked about this in other contexts. I think we always bring up the O.J. Simpson situation as being the classic example of it. A lot of times, the criminal justice system does not get you the justice that perhaps you deserve. And the civil justice system is the only way that you do have recourse. And we have statutes of limitations in the civil justice system, which might require us to file a lawsuit before a criminal trial is completed. And I actually thought it was interesting because this is a sentiment that I agree with. One of the women who testified, when they asked her about the fact that she had a civil lawsuit pending, and I don't think this was part of her testimony, but maybe this was something she said to the press. She said, and I'm just quoting this from an article that was on NPR. She said, if there's a kid with a stick who keeps hitting people, you take their stick away. Money is their stick, so you take it away so they can't hurt people anymore. And I think that's true. I mean, part of what a civil lawsuit, one of the tools of a civil lawsuit is to hit people where it hurts. And for a lot of these super wealthy people, that's where it hurts them, especially if this situation, they are going to hopefully be sitting in jail for quite some time, if not the rest of their lives. But in a lot of situations where there isn't criminal liability, hitting somebody in the pocketbook is how you do it. And in this situation, these were super rich guys. Their parents tried to put up a $40 million house in Miami as collateral for a bail, but their bail was denied anyway. These are super rich people who used their wealth as the way to victimize these people. So I agree with that. And the only two victims who were actually part of the criminal trial who had civil lawsuits, there were only two of them. Both of them were wealthy. One of them is the daughter of a billionaire. The other one is independently wealthy. So they don't need this money. So they're like, I think one of them said, I don't want your money, but I don't want you to have it either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually in a case like this, that's actually really helpful because um, you would assume, look, it's never easy for someone in this kind of a situation to bring a plaintiff's case civilly. They first of all, you get victim blame like this is happening, but it brings a huge spotlight onto you. It becomes very difficult to keep it confidential. Your life gets torn apart in public, especially in this kind of a case. It may affect your employment prospects. So it's a hard decision to make. So presumably it's somewhat more, you have somewhat more support if you're financially secure and you don't have to worry about some of those other concerns. So that's good that they were able to do that. I, you can tell the defense was trying to just portray these guys as these, playboy womenizers who were just having out to have a good time, and but clearly the jury didn't buy that. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but we do have this conversation with clients often about, they want justice and they want to, get certain things out of the civil legal system. But the reality is that money is the primary thing you can get from the civil system. So you're exactly right. It's, we hit people, you have to try to hold people accountable by hitting them in the pocketbook. And to your point, that seems to be what was impacted here. I will note, you just sent me an article. There's a lawsuit. A lawsuit's been filed against a nightclub in Miami. Coincidentally, we were just there 2 weeks ago. We were not in the nightclub though.
I was going to say not the nightclub.
At the Edition Hotel, which I know where that is. And apparently, the allegation is that the plan at this nightclub was to bring the best looking and most intoxicated women over to their VIP table at the basement or excuse me, at the VIP section of Basement, which is the nightclub at the Edition Hotel, and from there they would be drugged and assaulted. So the allegation is that the club knew or should have known that this was happening and allowed it to happen. So that goes to some sort of like negligent security and potentially dram shop type cases that we've talked about before. But I thought that was an interesting addition to this situation.
Yeah, and also potentially involved in kind of a human trafficking scheme if they were actively involved in funneling girls to these guys, which is pretty disturbing if that ends up being true. But yeah, like you said, I mean, those types of cases in New York are really just sort of a category of premises liability cases. So the question is, what did they know as the property owner? What should they have known? And what would a reasonable, business owner or property owner do in that situation with respect to barring these people from their club, having security, having some sort of, care for people who've been overserved or overly intoxicated. So, I'm not totally surprised to see that because it seems like these guys were kind of operating out of clubs and fancy hotels, and there's also sort of separate allegations that they also used their real estate business as a way to have access to other real estate agents. I think one of the lawsuits is by a realtor on one of the New York City reality real estate shows, who said that one of these guys drugged her and sexually assaulted her when they were alone together in a listing. And my understanding, having friends and a lot of friends who are realtors, that this issue of being sort of alone in a space with men, whether it's other real estate agents or whether it is a client, a potential client, or somebody stopping by an open house, that there is an issue with sort of sexual assault within the real estate business in general. So I just, this case is very nasty. I'm glad there's some accountability here, and that, we have seen, obviously the news is completely full of the Epstein files. This is sort of an example of where hopefully the system has not only chosen to prosecute these people despite their status and wealth, but that the jury actually agreed and believed these victims. And I read a lot of some of the closing argument by the prosecution, and this is like the little trigger warning. These guys were so brazen that they videoed a lot of this stuff and recorded a lot of this stuff, talked about it to each other in emails in a completely disgusting way, and text messages. One of the, this really makes you sort of appreciate the service that a juror is performing, because they had to watch a video of a 17-year-old girl being raped that one of these guys actually took himself.
Yeah.
And it's disgusting, and you can't unsee that. And, I think in the summation, the prosecutor was like, what you saw. We know what we saw. Um,
Yeah, I mean that's a classic example of, I mean it's really brutal and unfortunate, but common sense prevailing. Like you can spin things, lawyers are good at wordsmithing and spinning things and creating narratives, but sometimes evidence is pretty stark and it speaks for itself. So that's, it's horrible, but it's seemingly a good result in a case like this where clearly the jury believed that these guys were bad news, and hope, they say they're going to appeal, so we'll see what happens. But why don't we move on to another sort of, not good case? This is not an uplifting episode, but these are important, legal issues in the news. So a Georgia jury recently held, this is another criminal case, held a father criminally responsible for actions that were blamed on his son, who was alleged to have gunned down two schoolmates and teachers while he was armed with an AR-15 style rifle in their home. The jury in Barrow County, Georgia, found Colin Gray guilty of all charges, which included second-degree murder and cruelty to children in connection with the shooting on September of 2024 at Appalachian High School in Winder, Georgia. Colt Gray was his son who was charged with the shooting. Now, what's interesting is before the shooting, apparently his mother referred to another case where she urged that her son's access to guns should be cut off, and asked her husband to remove the weapons, and he didn't. And so when that came out, I imagine the jury was just like, nope. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I think this case was significant for a couple different reasons. I think it's only the second time
It
that
is.
parents have been prosecuted criminally for a school shooting. And then, from a kind of civil perspective, that would be another way to hold a parent accountable in this type of situation. I will say that in a school shooting situation, you're not necessarily going to have the hit them in the pocketbook situation that we have with these super wealthy guys that we were just talking about. But again, if the criminal justice system doesn't have necessarily a path towards holding someone criminally accountable, then civil liability is another way to pursue that in this type of situation. And, we have the concept of in New York, negligent entrustment with a dangerous instrument. So those are one of the few ways that we can hold a parent accountable for their child's actions. And in this case, I think you touched on this. Not only did the mother, um, have potentially perceived that this was going to be an issue, but this kid had like posters or pictures in his room of the shooter who did the Parkland shooting in Florida. I mean, this was like, not a good situation. And I think the father had bought him an AR-15 for Christmas. I mean, there's a lot of different cultural issues at play here that are a problem, but in a civil context, we did touch on this earlier as well. The issue is always like notice. What did you know? What did you do? What would a reasonable person have done? And clearly, this father was on notice that this kid was very troubled. And let alone buying him his own AR-15. A lot of times what we see in civil cases is not necessarily that you're handing the gun over to your child, but that you did not store it properly, or they had some sort of other access to it that made you kind of negligent in that situation. But I think that the fact that this is now the second time in a couple years that people have been held, criminally responsible in this context, hopefully that can act as some kind of a deterrent, because obviously this is an issue, and these are kids, so these kids are not going out and buying their own guns typically.
Yeah, and I think, Georgia's obviously a fairly conservative state as a general proposition. So I think it's fair to say that, you know, it's not an anti-gun area. And I don't think you have to be anti-gun to believe that when the writing is on the wall, as a parent, you have an obligation to try to prevent, foreseeable harm. And it's like you said, I mean, civilly, this would probably be a fairly clean argument that he had noticed and should have taken action. And so to see it escalate to the criminal side is interesting. And you have to hope that that starts to send the message, to the extent people are paying attention of, it's like they say to kids, if you see something, say something. It's like you can't just put your head in the sand because you have certain maybe feelings about, rights with respect to gun use. Everybody, I certainly don't disagree with all of the Second Amendment rights, but you have to. That doesn't mean you can just ignore these realities.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, there's no reason we see this come up in other areas having to do with, gun violence in general, but I don't know that it needs to be treated sort of any differently than anything else. People do tend to get sort of protective of their rights. But I mean, you have a right to drive a car too, and nobody thinks that a parent should give some, drunk kid or a 7-year old, their car to go drive around like a crazy person. So, I'm glad to see that there's, use of these criminal laws to hold these people accountable because this is obviously a problem that we have in this country, and we need to kind of use whatever tools we have to try to prevent it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, all right. Well, that's, kind of an update on that case. The only other thing today that I had was a brief update in the Sharon Moore case, the former University of Michigan football coach who was uh, this all over the news for, I don't know, maybe a week. Is that about right? It came and went
Yeah.
quickly. But he was, for those who don't remember, he was charged with a number of felonies, including felony home invasion, misdemeanor stalking, misdemeanor breaking and entering, and for related to an alleged break-in at a woman that he was allegedly having an affair with while he was the head coach of the University of Michigan football team.
I don't know if that part's allegedly. That
No,
happened.
all right, fine. Uh, anyway, he struck a plea deal in this, and as part of the plea deal, the judge actually dismissed all of the major charges, including a felony home invasion, misdemeanor stalking, misdemeanor breaking and entering. And he pled guilty to, or no contest, I should say, to charges including malicious use of a telecommunications device in the context of a domestic relationship and trespassing. Malicious use of a telecommunications device in the context of a domestic relationship. It's like cyber stalking, basically.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe he was harassing her over text messages or something like that.
Man, if that,
Um,
yeah, we that's more prevalent than people might imagine. But or maybe they do imagine.
Yeah, so I'll be interested to see if any of what else may shake out in sort of the employment context, because that was sort of what we had talked about in a couple of prior episodes. The woman who he had the affair with, who had been his assistant, does have attorneys who made a statement after this that was more in the context of the school and holding the school accountable for what they described as sort of harassment and inappropriate conduct that had happened over the years in the context of this affair that took place with this football coach. It was unclear to me, and I was not able to find whether she has actually instituted any sort of legal proceeding that would be public at this point against the school. I did read that she was, I guess, a contract-based employee and that her contract was not renewed. Um, so I thought that was a little bit interesting because we had discussed sort of in the past that when people were asking, well, why was she not also fired when the coach was fired? We said there is a distinction between sort of the boss and the subordinate. So it's not usually surprising in these situations to see the subordinate retaining their employment. So I didn't see anything specifically that she is challenging, her termination from the school or what the extent of, holding them accountable, what that actually means when her lawyers reference that. But so that may be something that we revisit if that kind of comes out, more publicly again. But, it's kind of a personal sort of issue that blew up. His wife was with him in jail holding his hand. I don't know. Not in jail, in the courtroom.
Well, everything else is, he's lost everything else, certainly his reputation and his career.
Well, who
So
knows though? I mean, now that he got off on this, one of like there was like a picture that was making the rounds of like one of the bailiffs in the courtroom, kind of like giving him a big hug afterwards. I mean, the people tend to sometimes brush this stuff under the rug with a short memory.
yeah, although he's definitely not going back to the University of Michigan. So we'll see where he lands. All right. Anything else you want to talk about today?
I don't think so.
All right. Shorter episode this week. We'll be back probably next week with another episode to kind of talk about some newer stories in the news, try to lighten it up a little bit.
Yeah, the
Although
problem for preparing for the podcast right now is the news is so It's
Yeah.
either Epstein files or are we entering World War III that the legal issues are not getting as much traction.
Yeah, we'll try to find some lighter legal topics to discuss to the extent that that's actually possible. But
I'm sure I can find
if
an update on the football player with the
no, all right. All right. If you have questions, anything you want us to talk about, please feel free. Hit us up at Litigious Podcast on Instagram. If you have legal questions that you'd like to discuss, feel free to reach out to us at Durazio Peterson on Instagram, DurazioPeterson.com on the internet, or any of the other ways that you reach out to professionals. So thank you for listening. We will be back again soon.